Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today in these videos, we are going to be talking about the book of Genesis again, but we're not going to be talking about the creation myth. We're going to be talking about the story of the flood. The flood is actually a concept that you find in a lot of different places, but probably most famous today from the particular story in the Abrahamic tradition that we call the story of Noah's Ark, right? And so that's what we're going to take a look at today, but we're also going to look at other myths that are related to that. And this is kind of beginning a little mini unit here of myths of destruction. We had our myths of creation, right? So now we have our myths of destruction. And creation and destruction are closely intertwined. And I think as we're going to see, there's some times at the beginning of the story when destruction is part of things, but sometimes destruction comes at the very end, basically the end of everything. And sometimes it's in between. Sometimes it's the end of the old, the start of a new sort of world. And that's what we're going to see today. So destruction is just as important as creation in its own way. Yeah, so today we're going to be taking a look at that. And specifically, let's start with focusing on the story of Noah's Ark and the flood as mentioned in Genesis. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to a Word document here so we can type up some thoughts. And then we'll get into a PowerPoint in a second here. But yeah, flood, very classic example of a destruction myth. And, think about how would we define a destruction myth? Probably something where everything is destroyed, where the world or human civilization or something like that just goes poof, it's gone, or it's wiped out in some big way. And usually there's some sort of reason given. Either the gods got together and decided to do this, or the god decided to do this for some particular reason. And in a way, you could think of it almost like an etiology of where do these sort of big moments of destruction come from, because we have things like natural disasters that people are familiar with. They happen all the time in the world, especially in ancient societies. So, this could be seen as an explanation for where those events come from. They come from God wanting to do this for X, Y, and Z reasons. So yeah, something to think about right there. So etiology is a big factor here. Okay, but how does it go down in the story that we read? So this is a continuing, a later passage from the book of Genesis. We're past the generation of Adam and his family now, but we're into the generation of Noah. Yeah, basically, I guess the best place to start with is with Noah. So Noah is a man who is described as blameless by God. Noah is a good guy, he's a good person, but the time period, most people are terrible. God sees that human beings' hearts are full of wickedness, and they're up to all sorts of bad things. And so God, it says, regrets that he created man. He says, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the ground, for I am sorry that I have made them. So this is kind of sad by comparison to the previous part of the book of Genesis, where God, makes all these things and he says he saw that it was good. But here, God sees the same things, including human beings, but also the creatures, the man and beast and creeping things and birds of the air, and he says, I am sorry I have made them. So God is in this place of regret and wants to destroy everything because it's all gone to the dogs. It's all gone to wickedness. And I think human beings, when we tell this story, we tend to put the emphasis on what human beings have done, that in this time period, people were pure evil or just acting really in a horrible, evil way. So that, we focus on that. But God also seems to just sort of regret the whole thing in general. But Noah is the one sort of person who might make him reconsider. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, so he's the best guy in his generation. And he walked with God, which is an interesting little moment of God being immanent. God is in the world, he's walking with Noah. So they have a pretty close relationship. And this suggests either that Noah has some special status to be close to God in such an imminent way, or that or that God in this story is more like a traditional God and less of an abstract, transcendent God as we usually think of him. He's more of a sort of a mythological figure in this story who can do things like walk around. Or it has something to do with Noah's special status. Take your pick. Um, but yeah, I should mention that before all this, we get this weird little interlude, which a lot of people have found kind of interesting, which is the Nephilim. So it says that they're, quote, sons of God, which seems to be more kind of a metaphor rather than like a literal thing, because this is not a tradition, unlike Greek mythology, where a god is known to, have lots of children. This is more like these Nephilim have been interpreted as angels or as some sort of giants, some sort of strange creatures who existed at this time. And the Bible, even though we just had this creation myth, the Bible and the Jewish Torah, they don't try to explain where the Nephilim come from. They just say they were on the earth at this time. They were around. But a lot of people have taken it to be implied that they are some sort of angels, possibly fallen angels because they're doing things that God doesn't want, and possibly some kind of neutral angels who don't really, take one side or the other in the battle between good or evil. These particular beings seem to be out for themselves. And some people debate, were they angels originally and they kind of got retconned into being angels? But the standard tradition is to interpret them as angels. And they get it on with the mortal women. And that leads to sons who are great heroes, and sometimes said to be giants themselves, said to be tall of stature. And this is kind of weirdly more like the Greek tradition in a way we don't usually see the Jewish tradition being. This idea that there could be like demigods, these great heroes who are leaders. It's not something that comes up a lot in the rest of the Torah because leaders are usually praised for being sons of these important human bloodlines, but not directly connected to God. So I feel like this might be a way in which there's a Greek influence, or even just a polytheistic influence from that part of the world, maybe coming from the Mesopotamian tradition, which did, I believe, have these kinds of sort of half-god heroes. But here they're half-angel heroes, which is kind of interesting. But all this is a prelude. And some people make a connection there that like the fact that the angels are getting it on and the humans are getting it on with the angels is part of their wickedness. And these might be mighty heroes, but they're not heroes in the sense that they're nice. They're sort of wild and powerful beings. So all this is kind of the background to the fact that God picks out Noah. But God likes Noah. And so even though God wants to destroy what he's created, the emphasis of the story isn't on God doing this act of destruction like it might be in another story. The emphasis is on God making a decision to save certain human beings who are good. So this is sort of a statement on the goodness of God in a way, even though he's doing this act of destruction. And so Noah, he basically gets the privilege of being the one to survive the destruction. So he's got his three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And he's got his wife, and he's got the wives of his sons. We don't really know the names of any of the women, which sucks, but what can you do? That's just kind of the focus that's being put here. But what is Noah commanded to do? You must build an ark, A-R-K, ark, which is a kind of giant boat. So God commands Noah to build a boat. God's going to do this destruction, but he's going to give Noah a strategy for surviving it. He says, make the ark out of gopher wood. We don't know what that is, but maybe it's the wood of the cypress tree. And he even gives exact specifications. He says 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. So he gives exact proportions. Cubits are a unit of measurement. We would say that that would be about 440 feet by 73 feet by 44 feet. And that would make the boat about 43,000 tons. So that is a pretty big boat. But it's got pretty big shoes to fill, or a pretty big role to play, because it's going to have all the animals on Earth. So God is going back on the idea of destroying the animals. Maybe there were some animals he didn't like. It's kind of hard to say. There's a lot of cartoons where like the unicorns don't get on the boat or whatnot. But yeah, so God is getting Noah to not just live, but kind of to shepherd the future. If you think about this as being connected to like historical natural disasters as a mythology, then it makes a whole lot of sense that that people in those situations would, try and preserve seeds, preserve animals. It would be important to try and preserve your livestock and your plants and animals, your resources. So I think that's pretty closely connected here, that these are the things that people would want to save. And so God wants human beings to save them too. Although the birds is interesting, the fact that he mentions birds specifically, I don't think there's like a whole tradition of like keeping birds for food like there is today. So that shows maybe a broader concern for all of nature, which is kind of cool. Okay, so of course God is going to bring the flood. So that's going to happen in a second here. But I should actually mention that you remember how we had different authors back in the first part of Genesis? We called them J, E, and P, and you can kind of tell them apart to some degree. Well, especially J and P, because they use different names for God, and they also have some other different linguistic quirks that are kind of hard to spot, but scholars who really know Hebrew are able to spot them. So J and P are the two writers in this story, and P is for Priestley. So Priestley is more concerned with the origins of religious type stuff and the relationship between God and humans. So when we keep an eye out for moments like that, where we see sort of the origin of religious ideas, that's our guy Priestley right here. And then the rest of it is written by Jay. But I should mention that they kind of have a different approach to the whole business of the animals. If you look real closely here in books, or in chapter 6 and chapter 7 of this story, we have two different descriptions. It's repeated of human beings being told by God to take the animals. Let's see. So yeah, Jay says, take all the animals and in 7 pairs of each. So I think our pop culture image is that Noah takes 2 of every animal, but according to Jay, it's 7 pairs of each animal, and it's both clean and unclean. We haven't really talked too much about kosher in the Jewish dietary code, but some animals have a kind of pollution associated with them, and you're not supposed to eat them. And there are parts of animals too, like the blood, that you're not supposed to eat either. And so the fact that that Jay is having God say, take 7 pairs of the clean and unclean animals suggests, this wide sense of preserving life on earth. Whereas Priestley, and I believe Priestley's passage is earlier, yeah. So Priestley in chapter 6 says, take just pairs of animals. So the pop culture image is coming from Mr. Priestley here, and he only mentions the clean animals. Of every living thing of flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Take every food that is eaten and stored up, and it shall serve as food for you and them. So Priestley talks about taking pairs of the clean animals, such as the birds and the animals that are familiar from the Jewish tradition, but Jay specifically goes out of his way to emphasize the unclean animals as well. And it seems like it's more, for Priestley, he's more thinking about food, where Jay is more thinking about, the future of ecology. So Jay is, I guess, a little more eco-friendly, I guess you could say. Okay, so then the flood comes down. And it's at this point that the story mentions that Noah is 600 years old when this happens, which is pretty wild. But this has been the case with everybody in Genesis so far, is that they've lived really long times. One guy, Methuselah, even lives to like 900 something years old. And so Noah's 600 years. He's lived a good long life. And I think this is most striking in comparison to the Greek tradition of the Golden Age story. Because in the Golden Age story, you have people living for hundreds of years in this ancient before time, when human beings lived a really long time and they could just eat food off the trees and life was really easy for them. It's tempting to think that, somehow one of these myths influenced the other, this idea of there used to be a time when human beings lived a really long time. And after the flood, human beings are not going to live so long anymore, although it keeps getting lower and lower. Like after the flood, they're going to live like 100 to 200 years, and then later on, they're only going to live like 70 to 80 years. So it keeps sort of declining, which again feels a lot like the Golden Age versus Iron Age story. But things are going to change on an almost like existential, metaphysical level. The way the universe works is going to change because God's sending this flood. He's really starting over. He sends all those things into the ark, and he sends down the flood. After 7 days, that's a pretty quick turnaround to gather all the animals. 7 days. Then the flood happens. And it even gives you an exact time. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, so I guess the equivalent of February 17th, the fountains of the deep burst open and the windows of the heaven were opened. So what the heck does that mean? So I think it has to do with this concept of the firmament. So the firmament being like the sky is a box over our heads, or maybe like a dome that blocks out. What does it block out? In the Mesopotamian tradition, it blocks out the water. And this is something we saw with Tiamat. The world was all water. It was salt water and fresh water. And then the gods defeated both of those gods. And they took Tiamat's body and they made it a barrier to keep her waters at bay. So Tiamat's corpse is like a barrier that's holding back the water that's just inherently in the sky. So, you've heard the sky is falling. Well, what if the sky was falling and also it broke and like sent all this water spilling down onto us? That would be pretty terrible. But that's kind of what is implied to happen here. God opens up the windows in the sky and sends water pouring down. And the mention of the deep, this concept of the deep, the depths, that's something that goes back to the original, when the earth was without form and void, and it was just water, and God shaped it by separating the water out. That's the Jewish version of that same tradition of creating a firmament and putting a firmament in the sky. But now God has poked some holes in the firmament, and so water comes down. And the whole family gets on the boat, and everything that Noah was supposed to put on the boat is on the boat, so that's good. And the Lord closes the door of the ark, which is really nice. This is another imminent thing, and shows this special relationship that Noah has with God. Okay, so you might have heard how long the flood lasts. The standard is to say 40 days and 40 nights. And during that time, everything is drowned. It goes into detail. Birds, cattle, beasts, all swarming creatures. I think they mean insects, and every man, everything on the dry land whose nostrils was the breath of life died. So yeah, that's pretty vivid. And only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark. And so the 40 days and nights is just the raining. And then we have this whole period of 150 days in the ark. But God remembered Noah and he made the waters subside. But I can't help but imagine that this was, an intense time for Noah. I mean, we feel like it's bad to be stuck indoors all the time. Imagine what it'd be like to be stuck on a boat for 150 days straight. But I guess Noah has a long life, so maybe he's good at waiting. But God made a wind blow over to kind of dry things up, which is interesting in the way that we're thinking that the wind is what dries things, and it's interesting because it kind of reminds me of Marduk. He's throwing these winds around, and the waters subside. He closes the deep off. He closes the windows of the heavens. The rain from the heavens is restrained, and the waters recede from the earth continually. And so after the 150 days, which was on top of the 40 days of just pure rain, the waters abate. And in the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month, that's an interesting repetition there, the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. So Ararat is traditionally the place where the ark landed. And the waters continued to abate, to go down. But, the mountain would be the place where it landed because that's the kind of top of the world. And the tops of the other mountains are seen. And then, after another 40 days, Noah sends out a raven to go investigate. Now, you might have heard about a dove, but we're getting to that. So the raven goes, and the raven flies around trying to find some dry land, but the waters aren't dried up yet. And then he sends out a dove, and there's still too many waters. And then he waits 7 days. So this is a long process. He sends the dove again. And this time the dove comes back with an olive leaf. So things are recovering. There's greenery on the world again, and Noah knows that the waters have officially gone down if the plants are growing again. And then just to be on the safe side, he waits another 7 days, sends the dove a 3rd time, and then the dove doesn't return to him. So then he's really clinched it because the dove has found a place to make her nest. So that's good news. Okay, so now Noah can finally leave the ark after 40 plus 150 plus 40 plus 7 days. And the earth was dry, and then God tells Noah specifically, okay, get out of the boat now, and bring you and your wife and your sons and your sons' wives with you, and bring all the animals, and they're very specific, all the beasts, every creeping thing, every bird. And Noah, so the first thing Noah does is Noah makes a sacrifice. He makes a sacrifice to God. He builds an altar to do it. So this would have been really a really familiar thing to the Jewish people back in ancient times. The way to have a relationship to God was to sacrifice an animal to him, like a sheep or a goat. And that's precisely what Noah does. In fact, he does it with every single clean animal and bird, suggesting that, they are, he's kind of enacting the fact that they're clean. He's commemorating what they are to this tradition. And God is pleased by this. And God is pleased by the smell. And this is what God wants in terms of worship. And it's at this point that Noah basically establishes a covenant with God. God agrees because Noah has made the sacrifice into him and shown that he's, a good guy and he's trying to be right with God. God agrees not to curse the ground, which is interesting. which is what he did with Adam, is he said the ground is going to make you toil and it's going to make you sweat and make you struggle. So God is basically saying, okay, you get to have good things and grow food more easily. And God goes on to say that I am not going to send another flood. This is my promise to you, is that I will not do that. And the promise is the rainbow. The rainbow, you might have heard, is a sign of God's promise that he will never flood the earth again. So when it rains, you'll sometimes see a rainbow as a reminder that no, the rain is not going to drown the whole earth. That only happened that one time, and it's not going to happen again. So there's a lot to talk about here, right? Because first off, it's an ideology of where the rainbow comes from, and also kind of an ideology of this relationship between humans and God. And God's bow, God took his bow and he put it in the sky. Where else do we see that God has like a bow and arrow? Well, we don't really see God like hunting or hunting deer or going into archery contests or anything like that. So a lot of people think that this is kind of related to another story which we are missing, that in other stories God did things with a bow and used a bow a lot more often. And for parallels to this, we can see in the Mesopotamian tradition there's a lot of gods that rely on archery, and a few in the Greek tradition as well. Marduk especially is someone who shoots with a bow and is maybe the most similar to God in certain ways in being associated with the creation of everything. And so, God's bow may be influenced by something like Marduk's story. And we know that at least one of these guys, Priestley, the Priestley author is someone who was writing this down while the Jews were in Babylon. And so comparing his own traditions to the traditions of this Mesopotamian culture. So who knows what exactly influenced him, but clearly God approaches the bow in a bit a different way. He's almost like he's hanging up his weapon, so he's saying he's not going to, use his weapon on humanity anymore. So he's making peace with human beings, which is pretty cool. Marduk, you get the impression that maybe he would go to war against human beings, but God would not. So that's pretty interesting. And all of this is part of a covenant. This idea of a covenant meaning a special agreement. And the book specifically compares it to like an agreement between a king and like a lord. So the king has these rules and regulations, but he'll protect the subordinate that's working under him. And the subordinate, wants certain things from the king, and he'll get them if he's loyal and he does what the king wants. So that is kind of being paralleled to the relationship between the Jews and God, but it's also kind of like a business contract you could think of it. But basically, both sides ideally will benefit. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. And unlike the Mesopotamian tradition where where Marduk made humans to do the work that gods didn't want to do, now it's sort of more like we're both doing work in this relationship, and so it's sort of mutually beneficial. And what it is for humans is that humans will make sacrifices and worship God, and God will take care of human beings, particularly the Jewish people, who, let's be honest, are the focus of this story. But we don't really care about those other people. We all, out there in the world who probably got drowned in the flood. We only care about God's relationship with the people, with us, the people who are telling this story. And this is a tradition. This idea of establishing a covenant is something that God's going to go on to do over and over again with the Jewish people. The really big one is a guy named Abraham, who establishes the nature of the religion and is the ancestor basically of all the Jewish people. But Abraham is a big one, and Moses is another. And it's with Moses that God gets more specific. Actually, it's kind of, he gets increasingly specific as time goes on. First, you have Noah, which is just sort of a general positive relationship, sacrifice some animals. Abraham, it's more like, you are the chosen people. And with Moses, it's like, here are the laws, here are the rules and regulations I want you to follow, and I'm going to be really specific, and it's your job to communicate these to people. And so these are all significant figures in Jewish history, prophets in some way or another. And in the Islamic tradition, they continue to be prophets. Abraham and Moses are, and Jesus for that matter, are important in the Islamic tradition. And so they are important figures. And so the idea of making this covenant with God is something that happens several times, but the first time it happens is in this idea of, be good people, and I will take care of you and not destroy you. And, here's what you do to get right with God. Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, but there's even more. God also says that people are allowed to eat meat now, which is something that's subtle, but it's there. If you blink, you might miss it. But God, in addition to making the growing food, the growing plants better, he allows human beings to eat meat, which apparently wasn't a thing up until this time. And the meat is a big part of the sacrifice stuff. You sacrifice the animal, you're going to have a lot of food that you can eat, and the parts that you can't eat basically go to God. And that's true in other traditions as well, where you sacrifice it to the gods. And so meat is really strongly connected to sacrifice. But also here, it's almost like God is sort of reorganizing the world to make it more comfortable for human beings. He gives them another food source. Back in the creation story, or back with Adam, he said, you can eat all the food on the ground, all the green things, but now I'm letting you have another food source, which is meat. And I'm not exactly sure how it ties into morality and the idea of, being able to kill animals and whatnot. It seems like there's something there, but yeah, you could go in a variety of different directions with it, that human beings are allowed to do this because it's considered necessary for their survival, and God is taking care of them, even though he might have been reluctant to let them eat meat originally. I think that's an interpretation in some Christian traditions. Okay, and then finally we have this really weird interlude, which is what happens after, which you might be remembering it, to the sons of Noah. Noah, he tills the soil, which is good. He grows stuff in the ground just like God promised him he could. This actually ties back to Cain. So you might have heard of Cain and Abel, sons of Adam. Cain killed his brother Abel, and God had a variety of punishments for Cain. One of them was that he would be unable to farm. The ground would be cursed for him. But Noah basically represents going back to the way things were. Because Noah is good, but Cain was, let's face it, basically evil. And so Noah kind of recovers what Cain lost there, this ability to till the ground. So that's pretty cool. And then it goes in a weird direction from there. Noah plants a vineyard. He grows grapes and he makes wine. And then he gets drunk. And he falls asleep naked in his tent. Which is an odd thing to have coming after this. He's this heroic figure. He's such a good figure, but there's a couple of different interpretations. Maybe it's saying that Noah is flawed. Even he is not without mistakes, and even he is not perfect. Even though he's a good guy, he still makes mistakes. But another way to interpret this is like, yeah, Noah should get drunk. He's celebrating the ground and the stuff that God gave him. So yeah, he's entitled to do that. He's entitled to celebrate the fact that God has blessed him with being able to grow these plants. That drunkenness is a gift here. So a variety of different interpretations you can make of this. But what happens after is that his sons accidentally walk in on him naked. Which is just not a fun experience to walk in on your father naked. And Ham particularly sees him naked. And then Ham goes and tells his brothers that his father's naked. And then Shem and Japheth, they walk in with like a blanket over their head, and they deliberately like avoid looking at him so they do not see his nakedness. So they have this kind of, respect for him, which Ham, the story doesn't make it clear if Ham seeing him naked was by accident or he was actually being callous there. But Ham is seen here as doing a bad thing that Shem and Japheth, they avoid. And Noah curses Ham's son, which is a pretty wild move, and maybe another sign of Noah having feet of clay, being flawed in some way, or maybe this is just a sort of explanation, an ideology that doesn't really fit in with the sort of rest of the tone we take with Noah. Maybe this is putting multiple stories together, parataxis, and that in one story Noah is this positive figure, in another story he's more aggressive and more harsh. Or maybe this is just not seen as harsh, but this is seen as a reasonable thing to do, is to curse your son, or curse your grandson. But basically the curse is that that Canaan will be the race of a people who are bad and get taken over by the other people. So that basically Canaan's descendants are going to be slaves to Shem and Japheth's descendants, and they are going to be bad people who don't get to be part of the Jews and part of the tradition. And what this is an ideology is basically the other people who are non-Jews, particularly a group of people who are known as Canaanites. And we're not entirely sure who these folks were, but I think the general consensus these days is that they were probably the same people we call the Phoenicians, and they lived in the same area as the Jews, but they didn't have the same religious tradition. They didn't have the same kind of God and relationship to that God. So this is an explanation for why are these other people in the world, and why are they bad, or why are they people who deserve to get taken down a peg in some way, because they're descendants of this curse. And Roman mythology has something similar to this in a way, where the sons of the queen of the Carthaginians had a bad breakup with the ancestor of all the Romans, and so she cursed their descendants to forever be at war with each other. So here we have something kind of similar in that. But yeah, it's a strange moment because we just got done talking up Noah and how great he is, but now Noah does something that I think we would consider kind of a shame. But yeah, basically that's the story. So you can see there's a lot going on here. But I think there's going to be even more when we compare this to other flood stories and look at them and look at how different interpretations interpret this idea of a flood, continuing our theme of destruction. So I'm going to get into that in the next video. So I will see you guys there.